I'm a nature nut, I'm not afraid to admit. I'm wild about the wild things and I'm proud of it. I'm just a simple case, open and shut. No doubt about it, I'm a nature nut. Today we'll go bird watching, tomorrow we'll catch toads. The next day we'll take photographs of bugs along the road. I never get the feeling that I'm in a rut. That's why I'm a nature nut. Well, I'm a nature nut, I'm not afraid to admit. I'm wild about the wild things and I'm proud of it. I'm just a simple case, open and shut. No doubt about it, I'm a nature nut.
Well, hello there, nature nuts. How are you? Today we have, well, it's kind of a serious topic. Today we're going to talk about introduced species. Species of animals that have been brought from their native land by people to a new place where they've successfully established themselves and thereby expanded their ranges. It's a very common phenomenon. It's a big topic. And I wanted to tell you, too, that a while back I asked myself, John, what are the biggest environmental changes that you've seen in your life? Not just things you've heard about or read about, but things that you can actually see, considering that, you know, I spend almost all my spare time out looking at nature. And, you know, even though I've seen some habitat destruction and some effects of pollution and poaching and so on, the biggest changes have everything to do with introduced species. You know, Hawaii is the perfect place to talk about introduced species because it is loaded with them. It's an alien world. Alien species is another term that's often used for introduced species. It sounds kind of science fictional. They're often also called naturalized species. Sounds like you're some kind of immigration officer when you use that term. But it's a very interesting situation. You know, out in the salt water and even up into these tide pools here, almost all of the animals, you know, the fish, the crustaceans and so on, they are native species. They're species that have been here for millions, if not tens of millions of years. The islands are volcanic. They're made of lava, and they've been building up for about 30 million years. And the species that were originally here before people arrived, they colonized the Hawaiian Islands naturally, getting here either from the mainland or from other islands. Now, if you go way up to the tops of the islands, to the cool, wet, rainy forests at the top of the volcanoes, most of the things you'll see there are native as well, especially some of the most beautiful native birds, native plants, native trees. It's a lovely, lovely environment. But down here at sea level, where the resorts are, just about everything is introduced. It's an incredibly changed place from the way it was even a couple of hundred years ago. And in fact, it's changing now rapidly all the time. Because it's an island, and because, well, the whole chain is made up of islands, small pieces of land, naturally the extinction rate is quite high. And because of people, the colonization rate of new species is high too, so things are in a tremendous state of change and turnover. I've been here quite a few times. Every time I come here, something is new. There's some new species that wasn't here before, or something that I was used to is gone. It's a very, very, very tumultuous time. Things are changing really fast here in Hawaii.
Introduced species do most harm on islands, but there are many on the mainland as well.
Well, you know, bird watchers are always keen to come to Hawaii because there are fantastic native Hawaiian birds here, particularly the members of the Hawaiian honeycreeper family. Forest birds, some of them beautifully colored like the iwi and the apapani. But you know, it's becoming more and more difficult to find these native birds, and many species have already gone extinct. You have to go way up into the mountains in general to find the native species. On the other hand, down here around the hotels and at sea level, there are lots and lots of birds, but none of them
are native. They're all introduced, and they were introduced for different reasons. Some were introduced as game birds for hunting, like the gray francolin. It's kind of like a partridge, and they're very common around here now. Others were introduced for pest control, and the Indian myna is a good example of a bird that was brought in for pest control. It has become a bit of a pest in its own right, but it's an extremely common bird. And then the rest of them generally came in as cage birds. They were pets and people let them go and they established themselves in their own little populations. All of these introductions were an attempt to make Hawaii a better place. And it's a really good question whether it's a better place or not. You know, it would be really interesting to know, with all this development and all this habitat change, which of the native species would have been able to get along if there were no introduced birds competing with them. What about insects? You know, there are lots of species of introduced insects just about everywhere, and there are even more here in Hawaii. Ants. Look at these ants. Little tiny ants. I don't know what kind of ants these are. You can use your binoculars backwards as a magnifying glass, by the way. But they're very frantic. They're very long-legged and they're very frantic and they look very nervous. And it makes me nervous just looking at them. Because there are more than 40 species of ants that have been introduced to Hawaii. That's more species of ants than we have back home where I live in Canada. And it's, well, you know, you can't be too hard on them. In most tropical environments, ants are very important. They're important predators on other insects. They're important at turning the soil. They're very, very, very big in an ecological sense. But the Hawaiian animals and plants, they evolved in the absence of ants, so having 40 species of ants suddenly arrive on their doorstep is not that good a thing. There's one called the Argentine ant that has a bad habit of eating the ground nesting bees that are required to pollinate many of the native plants, and that's a bad thing. And there's also, apart from these little guys, we've also seen at night, you know, I'm the kind of guy who likes to get out the headlight and go night bugging at night, but on these same palm trees, you'll see big-headed ants, Phaidoli. And they are kind of interesting because they not only have the worker caste, they also have the soldier caste. The soldiers are great big-headed things, even though all of these ants, all the ants that I've seen so far are very tiny, but compared to their tiny worker sisters, the soldiers are great big-headed goofs. And, you know, that's kind of neat. That's something I don't see back home. Anyway, ants. There are ants just about everywhere, and now there are ants here too. An important killer of native Hawaiian birds is the disease avian malaria, which is spread by an introduced species of mosquito. Okay, well, you know how much I like dragonflies and damselflies, and in most places there aren't too many introduced species of either. And that's true here in Hawaii as well. One moment, I've got one here, and this is an introduced species of damselfly. It's a beautiful little thing. There we go, have a look at it. This is a male Ramber's forktail, and you can tell that for a couple of different reasons. It has a beautiful sort of greenish thorax here and a beautiful blue tip tail, and this thing is not a real problem when it comes to the native damselflies of Hawaii, because most of them are in the higher country and they breed in swift, fast-flowing streams or in the pools of water that form at the bases of broad-leaved plants, certain sorts of native broad-leaved plants. Wonderful adaptations, but these introduced forktails only breed in ponds, usually at lower elevations, and this one doesn't even mind a bit of salt in the water. So I'm going to let that thing go. If it wants to go, do you want to go? Maybe not. Okay, I'll just tell you that the native damselflies are absolutely, look, you're bugging me, guy, come on. There we go. The native damselflies are absolutely wonderful, and there's now a guide to them
It's called Hawaiian damselflies. And it shows you all sorts of incredible native damselflies. They're kind of like the finches of the Galapagos Islands. One damselfly, probably a mated female, arrived here who knows how many millions of years ago and then radiated into many, many species. And they all have their own unique color patterns and they're only found here in Hawaii. So that's not something you'd like to mess with. Fortunately, most of them are still in good shape. They've got good populations, but only higher up in the fast-flowing streams and the cool, cloudy forests. In Hawaii, field guides cannot keep up with the inflow of new species, and they need to be revised every few years.
Oh yes, jolly old England. I'm just reminiscing about my days in Oxford. You know, I really like traveling. I enjoy traveling, whether it's a trip to Hawaii or jolly old England or even around Canada. I did spend some time in Oxford, you know. I wasn't a student there. It was nothing as prestigious as that. We were engaged in a beetle study. The reason we were interested in these ground beetles is because many of the British ground beetles have been introduced to North America and become very common, especially in gardens and around buildings and around people. So we thought, well, what can we learn by studying these beetles in their native land? The ones that are super common in gardens in Britain, they didn't do very well in North America at all. In fact, they never became established. The ones that did become established in North America and do very well in gardens, well, back home in Britain, they're not very common in gardens at all. In fact, they're generally uncommon and they generally live out in the woods someplace. So what it told us, the way a species behaves, the ecology of a species in its native land is no guarantee that it's going to behave the same way when you introduce it to a new place. It may very well do something completely unpredictable, which is another good reason not to introduce species willy-nilly around the globe.
You know, in most parts of the world, introduced fish are there for sport, for angling. But here in Hawaii, well, there are introduced fish, but they're not here for sport or angling. They're here for other purposes. Now, I didn't expect to do any fish catching, but I'm ready. I've got a pool skimmer net, plastic nut jar. Let me show you some of these introduced fish. Piece of cake. Okay, let's have a look here. This is beautiful. It's almost as good as being at a public aquarium. There are two species of fish in here, and most of the fish are mosquito fish, Gambusia. And like their name suggests, they were brought here originally to control mosquitoes. What they do is they eat the mosquito larvae in the water. They always hang out near the top of the water, and that's where the mosquito larvae hang out as well. Why did they need fish to eat the mosquito larvae? Why did they need to bring in fish? Because they'd already accidentally brought in the mosquitoes. It's, you know, just a little bit of escalation of introduction. But, you know, here they are, and they're very well established. They do well in fresh water or slightly salty water. They don't seem to mind. There's some concern that they might be competing with native insects or maybe even eating native insects, but I don't think anyone really knows. The other ones are these ones here, and you can see they have a little bit of stripiness to them and a dot on the back of the dorsal fin, the fin that runs along the top of the back. Those are baby tilapia. Tilapia is both the common name and the scientific name, much like it is for the rhinoceros or the begonia. And well, they're cool fish. They were originally introduced in order to control algae in drainage canals, irrigation canals, things like that. They do eat algae. They grow very big. They get to be lunkers, you know, big fish, pounders, many pounders. And they do eat algae, but they also eat everything else. So in that sense, they're quite disruptive. And again, you know, maybe not the best thing to have here. It's not really known whether the mosquito fish are competing with or eating native insects or competing with native fish, but it's entirely possible too. Fortunately, some people like to eat the tilapia, so they're now being fished for, and there are even some fish farms where they raise tilapia for human consumption, but it just gives people another excuse to take them from one pond and put it in another pond. Anyway, there you go. A spectacle in its own right. Introduced fish.
In many cities, the most common birds, butterflies, ladybugs, worms, and ground beetles are all introduced species.
Well, the year was 1999 at the end of the holiday. Little did we know on our way home that we would go astray. We took a turn, we shot right up and we headed for the stars. In the cockpit sat the pilot, a man from the planet Mars. So we found ourselves on a strange new world with open fields and snow. In the cold and ice, no paradise, we'd go with our winter clothes. They told us why they brought us here, oh weird and so perverse, to make Mars into a better place. The important vacationers. Now we are an introduced species, we invade new habitat. It's not our fault, we like it here, we are just like doves or cats. We were hungry back in the early days, so we ate what food we'd brought. Then Annette said, "Boys, these Martian trees taste just like apricots." With food enough for all of us, we decided we would stay. So we settled down and we raised our kids in the brand new Martian day. Then one day we met the native folk, they were all so slow and daft. So we got real rude and we stole their food and we stood around and laughed. It was good, we thought we were Martians, now don't you know things have to change. We forgot our jobs and our former lives till the earth seemed old and strange. Then the men from Mars looked out their door with horror did behold. There were tourists almost everywhere, spread out of control. So they tried to eradicate us, but the damage had been done. Now forevermore there were tourists here, neath the rose-red Martian sun. Now we are an introduced species, we invade new habitat. It's not our fault, we like it here, we are just like doves or cats. It's not our fault, we like it here, we are just like doves or cats.
Well, the end of another beautiful day in Hawaii. The sun is about to set. The tourists are on their patios having their drinks, waiting for the famous green flash of the sunset that nobody ever sees. Just an excuse to have another drink at sunset. And the cattle egrets are returning to their roost. Now, cattle egrets, it's a bird, it's a small bird in the heron family, and they were brought over here many decades ago by ranchers who thought that they would be a good species to control the insects on their ranches. I mean, in those days, the thinking was quite simple. They figured insects are bad, cattle egrets eat insects, cattle egrets have got to be good things. But, of course, cattle egrets don't just eat harmful insects, they eat everything. They even eat baby birds and bird eggs, and they don't know whether they're eating some other introduced bird's egg or a baby bird that is almost extinct, some rare and endangered native bird. So, in retrospect, the cattle egret was a bad species to use for biocontrol, the use of one species of animal to control a pest. These days, biocontrol, most of the time they try to find parasites or predators that only work on one species, and hopefully that species is your pest species and they leave everything else alone. It's very difficult to do that, though. But you know, the cattle egret is an interesting case because it's very good at finding places like this on its own. Originally, it was native to Africa, and not long ago, it found its way across the ocean to North America. Nobody helped it. It's not an introduced species in North America. It's a naturally occurring species. It got there by the process of dispersal. That's what we call it when they get there on their own. Dispersal. So who knows? In another couple of tens of years or hundreds of years, maybe we would have had cattle egrets here, people or no people. It's hard to say. There they are. Nothing we can do about it now.
Introduced species are like terrorists. If only one or two slip through your defenses, they can ruin things for everyone.
Well, I hope you can see just how much of an impact introduced species can have on the new environments in which they find themselves. Sometimes they're so successful that they cause the extinction or the near extinction of native species, and you've got to admit that's a bad thing. On the other hand, it's hard to blame these animals for their own success, and I'm sure that most people would agree that some of them, at least, should have some of the rights that we give to native species, rights to their own existence. It's a very tricky, complex ethical issue. I've even had some biologists ask me if I was going to say that humans were the ultimate introduced species, since we're the ones who are responsible for other introduced species, whether we've introduced ourselves into a few too many places, and I'm not even going to touch that one. That's far too complex and ethically fuzzy for me. I want you to remember, though, that there really was no time when the world was normal, when the balance of nature was set. The climate of the world is continually changing. The ranges of animals are continually changing as well as they disperse on their own without our help. And really, there's no one perfect time that we could ever go back to, even if we were to put conservation as our top priority for the entire planet, which is obviously not going to happen anytime soon. Would have been cool if there was a time when everything was normal. I'm not a real big fan of normal myself. I guess that's why I'm a nature nut. And I hope you are too. See you again soon. Don't go getting normal on me.
Same time each and every week, uncensored and uncut. No doubt about it, I'm a nature nut.